Good evening to one and all. I'm your host for the PGC Weekly podcast session today. I would like to start the podcast series by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples, the traditional custodians of the lands where each of our UNSW campuses are located, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and emerging, and their communities who have shared and practiced their teachings over thousands of years. We recognize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples' ongoing leadership and contributions, including to business, education, and industry. Today we have got Professor Josh Keller as our guest speaker. He is a professor who studies how to think more effectively as a manager by incorporating a paradox mindset and a global mindset. Professor Josh also oversees the Masters of International Business program at UNSW and is actively involved in internationalizing the curriculum throughout the business school. He is a professor in management focusing on how to manage international operations, particularly how to deal with the cross cultural issues. His specialities lie in various domains such as international management, strategic management, organizational behavior, and cross cultural management. Okay, well, that was the introduction for our speaker for today. Let's move on to the topic of discussion, which is actually a pretty interesting one on managing the economy and public health during and post COVID 19. Also, let me just remind you that this podcast is not just about Professor Josh and myself, but it is for everyone who is watching that. So, since this video is going live and going now as a recorded version, we would like to have your comments once the recorded video is out for you all. To begin with, as per the WHO figures as of today, there have been 158 million confirmed cases of COVID 19, including 3,200,000 deaths reported to WHO. As of 9th May 2021, a total of 1,200 million vaccine doses have been administered. So, the first thing on this particular topic which comes to my mind is actually related to what's going on in India, which we will be coming to a bit later on. But I want to pay my condolences to everyone from India joining the session or viewing the live recorded session and who has lost their close friends or relatives. It's actually a really bad situation as per what we have witnessed, the videos coming out from there. But now the first question is on the global economy itself. According to the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, the pandemic recession is deepest since the end of World War II, with a 3.5% output contraction in 2020, which represents a 7% loss relative to IMF's 3.4% growth forecast back in 2019. More importantly, the consequences of the shock will likely be long lasting, while the medium term costs are still uncertain and vary significantly across countries. It is safe to say that developing economies will suffer the most. Whereas the IMF projects that the world GDP will be 3% lower in 2024 relative to the no COVID scenario. The number doubles to 6% for the developing world, despite the fact that the shock, as measured by COVID related deaths, was more muted in low income economies. So, how do you think, Professor Josh, we are moving forward from here on to have a better balance between managing the economy and health at the same time?
Thank you, Saurabh. So I first also want to give my condolences to those in India that are suffering and those here in Australia who have family in India who are suffering. I personally can relate to this issue because I've been in Australia since the beginning of the pandemic, but I have family in America. And a year ago, America was in its worst shape, and my own brother was infected, and he continues to have lingering health issues. And so it's a very, very serious issue, and it's a serious issue that is been at the forefront of my mind. And so my heart is out to all of you. What's also interesting, thinking back a year ago, is that really was a time where places like the U.S. and the U.K. were struggling the most. Both in terms of what we were expecting economically, but also in terms of public health. And now things have changed quite a bit. And so, the biggest thing to think about is is how hard it is to predict into the future, of which it is something that is important to do, particularly if you are a business and looking at how do you prepare going forward. It's really the fact that that now, that a year ago, who are the best models? Places like East Asia, we talk about a lot, but even sub-Saharan Africa was a great success story. And some people say that was such a great success story because of the fact that there was a good history of understanding what an epidemic is like and having basic measures to address that. And so having that societal awareness of an epidemic, not necessarily a pandemic, but of an epidemic, in some cases a pandemic, could really help. But now that we're getting to this stage where vaccinations may be the game, clearly that is going to create, that in itself can create inequality. So I guess if you're asking about the question about what is happening going forward, the obvious first answer is yes, we should be expecting that there'll be a recovery happening in the first world before you'll see a recovery happening in the third world. However, again, we shouldn't just be looking at these direct effects. We need to be thinking about, what are these other experiences happening? What kind of pressure is going to be put on the governments to act in certain ways? What cultural shifts are there? Are they going to allow? Are these developed countries going to allow migrants in, or is this going to be a different new normal? I think we need to pay attention to those as much as we pay attention to other things.
I think these are very valid points, Professor Josh, and I totally agree with you on some of the points where you've talked about the fact that how important it is to spread the vaccine in the right way. My second question to you is with respect to the arguments put forth both by the IMF chief, Geeta Gopinath, as well as WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros. So while vaccines and trillions in pandemic-related government, the spending gave a much needed jolt to the worldwide economy. But IMF's latest findings actually warn of an unequal recovery around the world. There was also a summit which was organized by the United Nations in the month of April on the topic of a vaccine for all, which brought together different senior officials from the UN, the government, the business, the scientific community, the civil society, who were trying to explore different ways they can guarantee equal access to the vaccine as a global public good. And they wanted to strengthen the country's readiness for its distribution. And in the same summit, it was also pointed out by Dr. Tedros that of the 832 million doses which were administered, 82% have gone to high or upper middle income countries, while only 0.2% have been sent to the lower income peers. And in high income countries alone, 1 in 4 people have received a vaccine, which is a ratio that drops very down to 1 in 500 people in poorer countries. So what do you think can be done to tackle such kind of a situation when there is, such a unfair way of distributing the vaccines?
Yeah, well, this is also a very good question. And what's interesting about this question is how important domestic politics play a role in here, and how interesting it is that now we have President Biden actually agreeing with you and saying that we do need to, from the U.S. perspective, be in a position to make sure that vaccines are available outside the United States. And now he's getting a lot of heat from the pharmaceutical industry. And I think this is also part of the dynamic. Now, to what extent were we expecting that most of the pharmaceutical success were going to be in places like the United States? We didn't know when they're developing. That's part of the issue when it comes to the development of a product like pharmaceuticals, in that private companies take resources from research scientists. So we can't necessarily say they're doing everything on their own. If it wasn't for the National Science Foundation and National Institute for Health, then they would not be, the pharmaceutical industry would not be in a position to be able to create these types of drugs. And so we often look at the United States as being a country that doesn't invest that much in public goods and infrastructure and other things, but actually when it comes to medical and scientific research, it actually leads the world in many ways because of the fact that it has this very developed infrastructure, federal government aligned that is able to do that. And so pharmaceutical companies benefited from it. At the same time, of course, they also want to recoup their investments. And so there definitely has been a pushback from the industry about this. And certainly it'd be a much better position in the world if it wasn't so heavily concentrated in America. But think about it. If Trump was still president, it would definitely be a different story because those are the dynamics within the domestic politics of the United States. However, just because Biden is announcing this doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen, right? And that I think is the issue, and that's why I think in the end it's often more of a question of culture than it is a question of economics when it comes to that particular question, because the idea will be how much pressure do the Americans who want to see the rest of the world vaccinated are going to put that pressure on them, and those who are not, because those who are not are definitely going to make arguments about a slippery slope. Now, so I think that, but you're absolutely right. This is the very, very tricky part. It's not new. We saw that happening with HIV, right? I mean, clearly HIV was impacted in developing world far more and continues to have cases, right? So it's not a new issue, but obviously with this new virus, the urgency is just tremendous. So I think that's my take on this.
I think these are very valid points, and how important it is to understand that this is not the time to enter into any vaccine politics, as I think Dr. Tedros has been continuously pointing out. But now I want to come to a very specific question for the country, which is presently in a devastating phase. So my third question is now coming back to the bad situation going on in India. In February, the healthcare workers and epidemiologists in India puzzled over their good fortune. Coronavirus case counts had come down. The demand for ventilators was also manageable at that time. And the experts were, in fact, predicting that the country would be spared with the second major wave.
Mm-hmm.
But in April, events had a different turn, and images which have gone viral on social media, they show that a lot of people have died. The crematoriums are full of scenes which nobody wants to see. Hospital beds and oxygen are scarce. Desperate patients and relatives have turned to their black market for medicine, while others are left to die outside the hospitals, which is a very miserable situation. So what do you think can be some of the steps which can help India to come out of this devastating situation with respect to their management of economy and health at the same time?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And one of the things that I like to tell my own students in terms of international businesses is never make claims about your expertise when you don't have it. And I certainly am not the person who can make any claims about how things have been managed in India and what people are going through when it comes to that. But I think what we can say, what I can comment on in terms of the case of India, because to some extent what happened in India is not too different than what happened in the United States earlier, is the idea of 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 just the difficulty it is to have vigilance past a first wave, and the idea of having that resolve at the so in many ways, when we look at the countries that have done well, and I don't want to include New Zealand and Australia, because I think that when you're, when you're that locked, being broken off from the rest of the world, and you can control migration, and even in the case of Australia, you can control domestic migration, domestic transportation to such a high degree in ways that you could never do in India, or in the United States even, right? I mean, I know that part of the issue happening in India earlier was with people that were from the countryside who went to their homes and spread disease, and the idea of how you can control those kinds of patterns. I don't think it's not fair to compare a place like Australia to a place like India, with vastly different types of density, income inequality, and then also how you can control the flow of populations from place to place. But I do think that what seems to be, if you look at some places that are probably more analogous, and I know that China, for example, is less transparent in terms of what goes on there, but you could definitely demonstrate that when it came to the two major features of how in a very large society with people moving around, how you can think about controlling the virus, two things that do seem to fit is the idea of norms and authority. So I think that if you have norms help more than anything, even when you don't have authority. People, what I mean by that is the extent to which people themselves have resolve to go through even during this difficulty, and authority, which is the idea of a top-down will to ensure that that's the case. And clearly, you find in the case of the United States, and probably in the case of India, it may be that they're similar in the issue, particularly not wanting to control religious events. We saw that happening in the United States. We saw that happening in India, right? Not willing to control, not willing to really put the pressure on public gatherings, but also in terms of the economic sector as well. But then that's the last part. And that's the part where I don't know if there's a good answer, and this is a struggle, because obviously in the developed world, when it came to the economic part, they could step on I guess I've come from America and say step on the gas. I guess you can say step on the petrol, right? And that's not the kind of thing that a place like India has as much as isn't as much of a position to do. And that, I think, is part of the struggle, is in terms of, without the same kind of financial infrastructure, it makes it harder to do those kinds of fiscal means of keeping people okay and also healthy at the same time. It's a lot harder.
Yeah, I think it's very bad to see that 400,000 cases are coming up, not one day, not 2 days, but consecutively for many, many days. And when a simple, way of living life, which is your oxygen, can't be found out in the hospitals, and you have to see the patients, your loved ones, dying outside the hospital. That's the scene which we have been seeing for quite some time now.
Yeah, it's tragic.
Yeah. Anyways, moving now from India, my next question is, with the very fact of developing the trust amongst the people to get vaccinated. For few of the benefits listed down by the experts, such as Dr. Fauci, has been to get trusted messengers into place, such as family doctors or popular personalities from the entertainment industry. And the rate of vaccination hasn't been that fast. So if you look at the few example, Israel is sitting at 60% vaccination, UK is at 53%, US is at 46%, Singapore is at 24%, where we are sitting at the moment, Australia is sitting at 4%, and India having a devastating situation at 10%. So, and the experts definitely suggest that if countries need to come out of this pandemic, their people need to get vaccinated. Just to give you an example here is that the two vaccines which are at the top, which is the Johnson and Johnson vaccine in the US and the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe, have been linked to an increased chance of a rare type of blood clot. We have already seen a lot of cases for that. And with countries like United States having a very higher goal of getting over 70% people vaccinated by 4th of July, what can be done according to you to create that simple sense of trust amongst the people to get themselves vaccinated?
Yeah, I mean, this again is a good question, and it relates to what I was saying a bit earlier about this notion of authority and norms, right? And I think that and there's been a lot of research on this in terms of how how tight or how loose the norms are of a society. And what's interesting is that India actually scores very high on tightness of norms in general. And the United States and Australia score very low in general. But it kind of illustrates, and what do I mean by that? It means, generally speaking, there are gauges of the extent to which a society do people follow what other people do. And so that can go a good way or a bad way, in the sense that if everybody trusts each other, and in a high tightness society, then actually participation rates you'd expect to be very high relative to a looser society. But if you don't trust, then it'll be the opposite. So I think that, and we saw some of that issue happening actually in China during SARS, where in 2003, where in Beijing there actually was considerable rumor mill about going on about not trusting the authorities about SARS, and that actually made things worse because in terms of that trust factor. So I think that what you see, the issues you find in a place like India are probably different than you find in Australia. But in Australia, you have this other issue, and in some extent, you have that issue in the United States, is people are still thinking about whether they should get vaccinated or not from this very individualistic view, which is, what is it going to mean for me? So, hey, if I don't need to travel anytime soon, like here in Australia, and they're only giving me the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the AstraZeneca vaccine is certainly not as effective as Pfizer, let me just wait. And that's already what you're starting to see. And part of that has to do with the idea that in a very loose society, and to be honest, in Australia, for a lot of people, the stakes aren't as high, they believe, at least not directly. They're not going to see that, even though what we know for a fact, and maybe in the case of the United States, they're doing much better with this, because there are enough people that know that it isn't just about yourself, it's about everybody. It's about that vaccine penetration is going to be that way. Now, I think in the case of India, obviously, and to some extent even in Australia, obviously the issues are somewhat related to access to the vaccine. So what I'm talking about is more on the demand side, which is already impacting Australia, because there are people over 50 not willing to take the AstraZeneca who qualify. But it also is eventually that may happen different places. But in Australia, that is definitely an issue, is on this demand side.
But I think, Professor Josh, that India is in a coercive state, right? It's in a forced state. They don't have any choice. If they don't get vaccinated, the people are dying there. So I think the people there now are understanding the simple fact that if they don't get vaccinated, then there is a probability of them catching the virus and losing their life. But in countries like Australia, US, UK, it's
Yeah,
not the state. They see that the circumstances are getting normal, so they have a choice of having a vaccine
exactly.
or not having a vaccine. So how can we make people have that vaccine and also create that level of trust which is required?
So what I think is so I personally feel, so again, I don't think this is the issue in a place like India, because again, these are about access, right? But how do you stimulate trust? Often, so the mechanisms are stimulating norms. Now, how do you stimulate norms? Is through people recognizing that other people are going to shame them for not doing so. And so I think the discourse needs to go from one of, how does the vaccine feel for me, which is this very individual thing, to how does this vaccine impact us, and others are going to think about us as a lower figure in society. Now, in a more tighter society like India or China or Singapore, that's easier. In an Anglo society, it's harder to do that, but it can be done. I mean, just think about, again, people, people rally around wars, and so I think you're absolutely right, is that without that sense of urgency, I think it's going to be hard for that urgency and the idea of complacency.
And I think the way personalities can influence their followers can also play a major role, because if they see that, oh, my favorite cricketer is doing something or my favorite actor is doing something, they also want to follow the same trend.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
anyways, I might move towards one of my last questions of the podcast, which will be towards the effective strategies which have really worked for countries which have done better than few others. So the two key elements here primarily included that the countries which did well, including countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, they were shutting down the borders effectively. And when they opened up their domestic borders also, they responded quite fast and efficiently. And I think this was also taken up by Dr. Fauci a few days back when he was going live with UNSW. So these countries were able to take action quickly and decisively based on the incoming data. So, and their contact tracing was also pretty strong, which somehow was the key to combat any large spreading of this virus. What do you think can other countries essentially learn from these countries?
I don't know if see, this is a good question, because I'm not so sure whether there is one model that fits all when it comes to these. Like I said, in the case of Australia, I mean, Australia has benefits in terms of and Singapore as well, in terms of closing off their international borders, meaning once they decide they can do it, they can do it. And they can control they can control movement a little bit more effectively. They did also, but I think what was more effective in both Australia and Singapore that was not effective in places like the UK or the US was on dealing with this question of tracing and having infrastructure with tracing, and having, which does in both cases link to having a better overall public health infrastructure that allows that to happen, and invest in those ways that the US and UK didn't do. But when it comes to this idea of opening, closing, in the case of Australia, it was really state governments that did that and not the federal government. And so in many ways, what you ended up seeing is the success story it may be just a product of the system that allowed a state to do things that in places like the United States they weren't able to do. So I think that the things to model are definitely more on the technological front and having the infrastructure there. But in terms of policies of opening and closing borders, I'm not so sure. And then now, of course, when it comes to this question of balancing the economy and public health, there may be this paradox that we are seeing right now in Australia's case, where, and New Zealand as well, where the success of closing borders may create more problems with opening borders later.
Yeah, but I think that if we try to replicate the same model, which is obviously not possible in case of the densely populated countries like India, and this has been a question asked by a lot of people: why can't India shut down this country in the same way? Because when they tried to do that in the last year, we saw that their economy went down drastically, because
Absolutely.
a lot of the people there are migrant laborers whose livelihood is dependent on the daily wages. So is it really possible to impose that kind of a lockdown situation in a country like India? What do you really feel about that?
No, so I think this is where what we hope to happen going forward are what are the lessons learned, right? So I think you're absolutely correct in that one of the one of the things that people like to talk about when it comes to how successful were you in your response is, in many ways, it's about who are the weakest links, and are you able to address the weakest links? And in the case of Australia, in the end, there really were no very weak links, in the sense that people were at the very bottom who are not the people at the bottom in Australia are not like the same thing as the bottom in India, right? But even so, people at the bottom got wages, they got protection, they got a way that allowed them to have resolve. Even in the case of Singapore, they got into trouble because everybody in Singapore was doing well, but not the foreign workers. And where were their outbreaks? Among the foreign workers, because they were the ones that they didn't pay attention to. And sure enough, that's where things spread for exactly the same reasons and issues that you find in a place like India. It's just, in the case of India, it's on a much broader scale, right? Is that if you don't have a mechanism for addressing the next public health crisis of how you're going to get those people to be safe and not hungry right away, then you're going to have it's going to be a problem. So that, I think, probably should be the lesson learned, right? Because there's no way within the current dynamic can these countries address those issues. I'm saying the reason why Australia was able to address it is because of what Australia had already. The question in India is what's going to happen next, right?
So I guess possibly the three key lessons what we can learn from today's podcast, and also from what you are saying, is also the importance of investing in health infrastructure. The countries which kept their health infrastructure at the bottom are also suffering the most, and they are now understanding the weightage that they need to make on the health and education infrastructure, also on the fact how important is the effective contact tracing, and finally how important it is to get yourself vaccinated.
Absolutely.
Yes. So potentially, I think with this, I come to an end to our first PGC weekly podcast. And on behalf of the entire PGC team, I would like to thank Professor Josh for taking his valuable time to join us for this podcast. And everyone who will be listening to this recorded session once it is out on Facebook, and tomorrow once it is out as an audio version, which will also be shared with you, Professor Josh. We hope to see more students joining the Zoom session from next week with a new topic and a new speaker with more insightful discussion. But till then, it's goodbye from my side and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.